Deputy Doherty.
Before I begin, I want to welcome the UN Special Rapporteur to the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese. I know she's in the Dáil today, and I want to welcome her. There's 250 UN staff who have been killed in Gaza since October 2023, and Ms Albanese's presence today here in the Dáil is especially important as Israel continues its genocidal war of the men, women and children of Gaza. We wish her well in continuing to speak bravely against this atrocity and standing up for the human rights of Palestinians. Iascan Corlia, the Jarmo Jantic and Realtas are Liania will react in a special taku agus Tushmari. Yell ribbon Tehanetual, Hashtel and Tara Rabbit, and then like Charlie McConnell, go Litcher Cannon, hung ogred €3.8 million the Jontasi, the Agriac in their Gundai and Gununal, la therapy of her well, the question in the role reacting is special taku. Sharp jig me own Fogerchin. On Kiad Ogurge a Runyanare, Niel Liffing away Ruat Hockado, Ain Candan the Hagriarty Shaw. Tashanish Rete Lomse, own Rin, Ni Wen now will arrogate the beyond, Aknoro and Aragadon or Harabi, August the Shaw Scanula. Yaskin Corlia, for too long, children with special needs and their parents have been left behind by this government. We now have another scandal where money to fund therapies for children promised by the government 17 months ago was never released. Taoiseach, the parents of children with special needs must battle the state every single day for vital services that their children need. It's a battle that they shouldn't have to fight. My own county of Donegal has become a black spot for supports for children with special needs. For years, parents have been forced to go it alone, crying out to the government to get their act together to ramp up service provision for these children. Then in October 2023, they thought their pleas for help were heard. The Minister Anne Rabbitte announced the Children's Disability Service Grant, supposedly an emergency stopgap government fund to urgently provide services and therapies for children with special needs throughout the state. One parent who was delighted, Taoiseach, with the news was Denise McGahern. Her 9-year-old son, Jack Donaghy, he has cerebral palsy. He's permanently in a wheelchair. Denise has been fighting for physio and speech and language therapy that he so desperately needs. And this money was to be allocated within weeks of the Minister's announcement of the fund being set up. 52 organisations across the state were to benefit from it. But months later, nothing happened. Then in June 2024, 2 days before the local elections, Minister Rabbitte travelled with Charlie McConnell to Letterkenny to announce that immediate allocation of €3.6 million in funding to provide essential therapies to 4 organisations in Donegal. Denise was contacted. She was asked if she and her son Jack would attend the announcement. They were included with the photos with the Minister. They listened to Anne Rabbitte when she told the media that the money would be, and I quote, an absolute game changer for children in Donegal and the surrounding area. They could finally see a glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel. But Taoiseach, 17 months since the Minister's first announcement, that light has vanished because none of this money has been released. Not one red cent, not in Donegal, not anywhere in the country. I went and sought answers on behalf of these families and have now been told by the department that not only is there no money, but that this money was never there at all. This is scandalous. I spoke to Denise yesterday. She's devastated. Taoiseach, she feels betrayed. She feels that her son Jack was used by the government in a prop and a photo opportunity during an election campaign. And I would imagine that parents right across the state, parents with children with special needs all over Ireland feel the same way, let down, betrayed again. Now, Taoiseach, you were Taoiseach at the time. How on earth, and I'll finish with this question, how on earth did a minister in your government travel to Donegal to make an announcement of emergency funding to be released within weeks to desperate families when the money was never cleared and didn't exist? How did that happen, and what are you going to do to make sure that that money is released to the organisations and families such as Jack can benefit from it?
Taoiseach.
Well, thanks very much, Luskin Corda, and thank you to Deputy Doherty for raising the question. I want to begin where you began by welcoming the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations for the Occupied Territories to Ireland. Thank them for their work, and I want to, particularly when a representative of the United Nations is in our country, I want to join I know with all members of this House, and indeed with the Secretary-General of the United Nations, in expressing our deep sadness and shock to learn the death of a United Nations Office for Project Services staff member when 2 UN guest houses were hit in Israeli air strikes. 5 other UN personnel were seriously injured, and of course hundreds upon hundreds of people killed in brutal airstrikes, including children, over the last number of days. An utterly despicable situation. Thank you for your question in relation to children's disability services. And let me firstly agree with you that this money should be released. And you asked me what am I going to do. I'm going to make sure it's released. I'm going to make sure it's provided. I've spoken to the Taoiseach about this matter in recent days, the Cabinet Committee on Disability on Monday, and I agree with you, this issue needs to be resolved. People, parents, their children, and organisations who applied in good faith for a scheme that I must acknowledge I think was an innovative and good idea to try and find another mechanism to provide much needed funding, and as you say, a stopgap level of funding to provide vital services. That fund needs to be provided, and I regret that it's gone on as long as it has. So actually thank you for raising the issue. Thank you for raising the views of Denise, and I'm sure there are many others like Denise who rightly want to know when is this going to be resolved. My understanding is that the HSE did launch, as you say, a call for what's called the Children's Disability Service Grant Fund back, I think, in October 2023. There was quite a lot of interest, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone, such as the level of need in relation to this. And following the evaluation process, the HSE have confirmed that projects with a cost of around €8 million have met the criteria for that fund. And this now needs to be provided. I want to say there's no fault on the organisations involved. I'm sure many of those organisations having to deal with the disappointment and concern of parents. The fault is not, of course, on their part. My view is very simple and very clear. If an application met the criteria under the scheme, then of course that application should be funded. So we need to resolve this. We need to resolve it urgently. And I want to thank you for highlighting the issue today. And I'm happy to directly come back to you further on this matter. This is one measure we've taken, and the funding needs to be provided. The second, in terms of what you call stopgap, but I think it's an appropriate phrase while we try to build up capacity, is the initiative that we also took last year in relation to trying to provide additional funding for assessments of needs, and many of which will be required by many of the families I'm sure you deal with in your own work. I'm pleased to say that an initiative we put in place in terms of providing funding for private assessments of needs where required has seen 2,479 assessments of needs commissioned from private providers between June and December of last year at a cost of €8.2 million. We've allocated an additional €10 million for that scheme this year.
Thanks. Taoiseach Deputy.
Taoiseach, imagine having a child with special needs, the love that you have for them, the fact that you'd run through a brick wall for them. Imagine having to fight every single day to get the services that they need to live, with the stress, with the worry, with the anxiety of the development delays, the possible impact on their lives, on their future. Imagine being told by government, a minister no less, that help was on the way. Imagine the incredible stress, the relief, the melting away of some of the stress that you felt for years. Imagine then having that help, that hope that your child was going to get the service ripped away from you, to be told that the help was never actually coming at all. Because that's what the government did here. And I ask you a question, because this isn't just a case of, we'll fix it now. This was cruel. This was cruel what was done. This parent feels that their child was used as a prop. How could a minister announce funding to organisations when the money didn't exist? This has been going on for 17 months. You've been Taoiseach for the majority of that. And you tell me today when I raise this in the Dáil that you'll look into this and you'll make sure that the money is going to be released. This has been going on for a year and a half.
Thanks, Deputy.
And this is only happening because the HSE are not providing the service. Can I just finish with one thing?
Your time is up, Deputy.
Jack has not had any physio or any speech and language from the HSE for a year and a half. For a year and a half, when the department made a promise in front of that child that he would get the services. It is scandalous. And I'm asking you, where's the accountability? How did this happen under your watch? And when is this money going to be released to these families and these organisations?
See, I'm not round with you today, Deputy Doherty, and you seem nearly disappointed that I'm saying I'm going to resolve the matter, because you're right to highlight this issue. You're right to call on us to resolve the issue. And we're going to do that. I mean, I'm not going to stand up and defend something that can't be defended. A scheme was announced in good faith, people applied, and the funding now needs to be provided. And the HSE has a level of funding that is almost eye-watering. And €8 million is a rounding error. And the idea that that €8 million that could make a fundamental difference to the lives of so many children, including in your own county, and hasn't yet been provided, is extraordinarily frustrating. And you're asking, I'm not commentating on this, you're asking me what I'm going to do. I've told you very clearly what I'm going to do. Spoken to the Taoiseach, he and I are leading on this issue. We have a Cabinet Committee on Disability, and I'm going to resolve the issue and make sure the money flows, because you've outlined the very serious human impact to young children when that doesn't happen, and I thank you for doing that.
Deputy Bacik.
As Cian Taoiseach, almost every day, US President Trump is finding new and yet more damaging ways to express his authoritarian style of politics. His policies have already impacted negatively on global measures to tackle the climate crisis. He's torn up the international rules-based order. He's intent on turning the clock back on federal regulation, on healthcare, on women's rights, on equality measures. It's hard to believe that we're just 2 months into his presidency. Taoiseach, what I want to raise with you today is how we in Ireland respond to US President Trump. And first, on the impact of Trump's proposed tariffs. Because here we are hearing that US pharmaceutical companies based in Ireland are already scenario planning for moving manufacturing to the US. And like all of us in this House, many people I represent are employed directly by US multinationals. And I'm hearing already from constituents who fear they may lose their jobs, who are worried about the impact upon their families, about being able to pay their rent or their mortgage. And amid this uncertainty, as we await the detail of Trump's plans and indeed the EU response, Taoiseach, you must give what clarity you can to those who are living in fear. We know that 7% approximately of workers here are directly employed by US businesses, with many more indirectly employed. US companies pay nearly €7 billion in wages here and of course make an enormous contribution to corporation tax receipts. So we couldn't be more exposed in terms of jobs and in terms of our economy from the risk of tariffs. Taoiseach, I raised this with you 3 weeks ago and you accepted my request to brief opposition leaders on the potential impact of tariffs, and I thanked you then, because as was done in the pandemic and in Brexit, there needs to be a flow of information to opposition. We hear the Department of Finance has undertaken scenario planning on tariffs, and that needs to be shared. Protecting our economy, our jobs, and the people who work in those jobs, that requires that we work together. So I'm asking that you would set a date for that first briefing. But I also want to ask you about other aspects of Trump's policies and how we in Ireland can respond. Undoubtedly, Trump is a very tricky character, and his Vice President Vance and indeed crypto Vice President Musk are really no better. What we're seeing them engage in on the international stage is a sort of wrecking ball diplomacy, aligning themselves with the bullying regime of Putin in Russia, aligning themselves with the regime of Netanyahu in Israel. So we must stand up to bullies. We can't seek to appease them at the expense of our Irish values. And Taoiseach, there are concerning reports from US lobbyists that they received a commitment from government to all but shelve the Occupied Territories Bill. And that's of particular concern this week, when we see the hideous carnage in Gaza with the resumption of Israel's genocidal bombardment. And I do also want to join in welcoming the UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. I had the pleasure of listening to her briefing earlier, and she spoke so powerfully about how we must stand up to Israel, how we must exert pressure on Israel, and in particular how we must pass the Occupied Territories Bill here in Ireland. So Taoiseach, my questions to you are, first, can we have a briefing for opposition leaders on the threat of tariffs from Trump? And secondly, can we have an assurance from you and your government that you will stand up to Trump, that you will insist that we assert Irish values and that we pass the Occupied Territories Bill?
Thanks, Leslie Court. I want to thank Deputy Bacik. I want to thank her for the suggestion she made, which is a common sense one in relation to a briefing for opposition. And I apologise just with the various international travel and the likes over the last while. There's been a bit of a laguna, but what I'd suggest is on Monday we should have that briefing for opposition parties. With me, or if my diary doesn't allow, certainly with senior officials, because we do need to get that flow of information going. I'm very happy to do that, and I'm very happy to commit to this House to obviously keep the House regularly briefed, and indeed, but also to put a structure in place to make sure you have access in doing your job, because this is, we're highly likely to face a very significant period of turbulence. And we've got to control what we can control in terms of what we can do here in Ireland. We've got to work as part of members of the European Union, where of course trade policy is at, and of course we have to engage, as you rightly say, with our FDI base that is present here in the country. In relation to the financial analysis or the kind of macroeconomic analysis that's been carried out, my understanding is this week it's likely that you'll see some research published in relation to that. What I would say in advance of that is that I think even in modelling, I suppose, we're operating with a lot of what they probably call known unknowns. in terms of not yet having seen the detail. But I think sharing the best information available is a sensible thing to do. I want to come back to trade specifically and to tariffs, but just on the Occupied Territories Bill, and I've spoken to the Taoiseach about this, Taoiseach absolutely reiterated the commitment to the programme for government in relation to legislating in this area. So whatever others wish to say, I don't mean you, the government's commitment remains as outlined in the programme for government in relation to that. Look, on the issue of tariff and trade, I think yes, you're right to suggest that obviously this country has a lot of foreign direct investment, and with that obviously brings exposure and challenge. That's true. We're also, though, approaching it from a position of relative strength, because regardless of politics, there's also a reality that many of companies are based here in this country not for the weather. They're based here because it's a good place to do business. It's a good place to access the European market. And many of them have not just years, but decades of experience of doing business in Ireland. And regardless of who's in the White House or what policies are pursued, it is a statement of fact that many American multinationals will still want to do business in a market with over 400 million people. And I certainly hear that in my interactions with them. On Friday, I'll chair the government's trade forum, and that brings together government departments, ministers, relevant state agencies, but crucially it also brings together sectors of the economy and business representative organisations to have, I suppose, that engagement and that flow of information that you rightly highlight. Can I also, in the time available to me, just say this, and hope that we could all speak with a Team Ireland voice in relation to this. Europe doesn't want tariffs. I've heard so much misinformation, and not from here, but in the last few days, of why won't Europe engage? The position of Europe is really clear, of which Ireland's proudly a part. We want to sit down, we want to reach an agreement, we want to do business with the United States, we want to buy more stuff from the United States. It does seem the tactic and approach of the American administration is to announce a series of measures first and then engage. We believe that's wrong. The engagement should happen now.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy
Well,
Bacik.
first of all, Taoiseach, I welcome your words on the Occupied Territories Bill. I think there is a sense, however, that the government is rowing back on the bill, is seeking to dilute it in some way. It has been published some time ago. Indeed, we were in the we supported Senator Frances Black in the Shannon. We co-sponsored it with her when I was a senator, and it's really, achieved such cross-party support. And I do want to commend Senator Black and indeed all of those who've been pushing for it to be passed. But we do need to just get on with it now and pass it. And as Francesca Albanese told us this morning, it's really only a small step, but an important one nonetheless, to mark our enormous concern about what is happening in Gaza, what is happening to the people of Gaza, and indeed in the occupied Palestinian territories too. So I would really look to push you further on that, on a timeline for that. Secondly, I welcome your offer of a briefing, and Monday would be very good. I think it's really important that we do get information from government as to the likely scenario planning, as to the prospect of the damage that the tariffs are likely to impose. And can I say finally, Taoiseach, I do welcome assurances I've received from senior figures in US multinationals here that they are committed to staying in Ireland, they're committed to retaining their workforce here in Ireland. That's really important, and I do think that also should be put on the record.
Yeah, no, thanks. I too welcome that. On the OTB, in the brief time available, my office was in touch with Senator Black yesterday to arrange for me to meet with her, and I'll come back to you once that's happened. In the vein of controlling what's within our control, I mean, I do think, and we can talk about this more when we have our briefing and engagement, but it is imperative that we look at what is within our control, what continues to bring jobs and investment to this country. Things like competitiveness, refocusing on costs, improving the stock of strategically important infrastructure. From a public finance perspective, building up a buffer. I mean, we were often, not necessarily by you, but by many others in this House, ridiculed for setting money aside for rainy days. People go, why don't you spend it? There's some in this House who believe, because I have it, I'll spend it, and even if I don't, I'll spend it. Thank God we've now actually set aside money in terms of funds for economic turbulence should that happen, and the Department of Finance will set out its updated assessment of the economic outlook, which will incorporate the latest developments in the global economy, and they'll also have their spring forecast that will be published next month. But this is going to require a very significant attention and engagement from everybody in this House, and I, on behalf of the government, want to work in a constructive way right across this chamber so that we can do our very best for this country in the time ahead.
Thanks, Taoiseach. Deputy O'Callaghan.
Taoiseach, tens of thousands of children with additional needs are being failed by this government. 14,221 children are overdue an assessment of need. New figures released to me show the scale of the crisis for children trying to access essential therapies. At the end of December, there were more than 41,000 children waiting for an initial assessment for speech, language and occupational therapy. The figures for occupational therapy are particularly stark. of the more than 22,000 children waiting for their first assessment, nearly half have been waiting for more than a year. Taoiseach, disability services were an issue that you said you would prioritise when you were Taoiseach. The current Taoiseach has said the same thing. Do these shameful figures really reflect an issue that has been prioritised by government? Is it any wonder that parents are at breaking point? Every day they endure stress and heartbreak watching their children denied the services that they need to reach their full potential. Children in some cases are regressing because they are not getting any supports. Parents are having to scrimp and save, trying to pay privately for therapy, because the only thing that you are guaranteed in the public system is a place on the waiting list. Taoiseach, this level of endemic dysfunction is reflective of a broken and failed system. More and more parents are being forced into litigation to get an assessment of need for their child. The number of legal actions being taken against the state has skyrocketed. In the past 5 years alone, the state has spent over 8 million on cases taken by parents who are fighting for an assessment of need for their children. Taoiseach, €8 million would pay the salaries of 180 occupational therapists or 130 psychologists. Imagine the positive impact that would have on the lives of the tens of thousands of children currently on waiting lists. Instead, it's been spent in cases that families should not be forced to take. Taoiseach, we've been told that when assessments of need are not adhering to legal timeframes, the litigation strategy of the state is not to contest these cases. Now, given that 90% of assessments of need are being completed well outside of the legal timeframes, 90%, is your government now effectively saying to families that they need to take legal action to get an assessment of need for their child and to vindicate their rights?
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
I want to thank Deputy O'Callaghan for raising what is one of the most serious issues I believe we face in the public service and in the lives of children with disabilities, which is access to therapy provision and the process through which they go to gain that access. And to be very clear, the waiting lists for assessments of need are far too long, and this is having a significant negative adverse impact on the lives of children and their families. I actually accept the point you made, and I think it is the right point, that we need to look at the actual system. And I accept that that's going to require a more detailed debate in this House. But it's very clear to me that if we have a situation where assessments of need lasting on average 36 hours, and in some cases up to 90 hours, before a child gets any therapy, even when the therapist carrying out the assessment doesn't believe that level of assessment is required. So be very clear before people misrepresent what I say. Children have a legal entitlement to an assessment of need. I believe that's vital. And I'll always defend and cherish that right. But it's the rigidity under which that right has been interpreted in terms of the number of hours which must be carried out that is causing very significant challenge. There's absolutely no point in my view, and I've spoken to many parents across Ireland in relation to this, that a therapist has to spend 1/3 of their working week on assessments rather than providing the therapy. Particularly when that professional, not me as a politician, but when that professional believes that their time could be better used in terms of the provision of therapy. So we've got to get to a better model. You're right, I did say this is an area of priority. It is an area of priority. I've met Cara Darmody, the incredible young teenager from Tipperary. She put it up to me very forcefully and very articulately and very compellingly that we had to do much better, and she also made a suggestion, which in fairness colleagues in the Labour Party put down a motion on in terms of using private money in the short term. We've done that. We've seen 2,479, I think, more children get assessments as a result of that. But it's not enough if we have a situation where we continue to have a child needing 36 to 90 hours of assessment when the parent doesn't believe that time is necessarily needed and the therapist doesn't need that. So I've engaged with both Minister Foley and Minister Naughton on this to see how the current system can be reformed, because I believe it's clear to everybody that it is not working. I can ream off figures, extra investment we've made, extra people we've hired, all of that, but it misses the point. If we don't actually change the system, and I believe that will likely require legislative change, I'd like to work constructively in this House to see if we can get to a point of consensus and agreement in relation to that. It's not about the right to assessment, which I'll defend, but the rigidity from the 2022 High Court judgment is, in the views of the healthcare providers, the single biggest challenge in terms of the waiting times for children's disability services.
Deputy O'Callaghan.
Taoiseach, what are parents and families to do now? They're at their wits' end. They're increasingly being told that the only way to get the assessment of need for their child that is needed is to take legal action. The state isn't contesting these cases, so the state and the government is effectively putting your hands up and saying that you're failing to meet the legal needs of children with additional needs. You're putting your hands up on that. So what's your advice to parents? Are you telling them that the only thing they can do is take legal action? Are you advising them to take legal action? What are you saying to the parents who aren't taking legal action and whose children are being left at the back of the queue? You've been talking for quite some time about sorting this out, but when are you actually going to sort this out? This is getting worse. The situation's getting worse. Parents are being forced into taking legal cases they don't want to take. So what's your advice to parents now, and when are you actually going to sort this out?
Fair question, but I think you'd rightly ask me a very different question if I came in here and said the state was going to contest the cases, because that wouldn't be a compassionate or decent approach to take in relation to this issue, because the law is clear in relation to the 2022 High Court judgment. And what I'm saying to parents is really three things. One, I think we need to reform the system, including potentially the law, and Ministers Foley and Naughton are looking at that. Two, I think we need to move beyond parents having education over here and health over here and never do the two meet. And we've got to now implement the programme for government commitment in terms of putting therapy services back in schools, starting with special schools. That process has begun. We're looking to accelerate the process. We'll be discussing that at our Cabinet Committee on Disability on Monday. And thirdly, what I'd say to parents is in the interim, in the here and now, that initiative that I mentioned where we're using private capacity that saw over 2,470 children get assessments last year that wouldn't have otherwise gotten them, that we've increased the level of funding this year to over €10 million.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
I know,
Deputy
as I
Councillor
outlined three
Connolly.
things.
Gur mil magad de lescian cóla, agus tá mig díúiste a táneiste an cinenne íhu a tá ag tarlú, agus tá muidmna I man canse, agus cinenne íhu winter na Palestina, agus tá muid ag fáil na mílte einachtaí, gatseach de dálan seo, ag chur brúaran ceannareacht a haspáins, agus rud a dhéanamh de réir am ríthair. Taoiseach, there are many things I'd like to engage with you today, but the ongoing genocide is uppermost in my mind and our colleagues' mind, and more importantly, in the thousands of emails that we're getting imploring us to do something in addition to our sweet words. Total disregard of international law by Netanyahu, by the Israel government and by the army. A body of international law which has developed to ensure that the very slaughter we're witnessing would never happen again. And yet we are seeing scenes of horror and destruction in Palestine. They were described by the UN rapporteur this morning. They were described by an Irish doctor yesterday. In the last 3 days, we have seen the end of the ceasefire unilaterally by Israel and an invasion by air and by land. Bombs dropping on defenceless civilians. We don't know the figure, ranging up to 1,000, 70% women and children. But of course, we've been told by the UN rapporteur that that is the ratio since the day that Israel started their genocide. And this despite Israel being under a legal obligation to dismantle the occupation by the end of this year, by the highest court in the world. And what we were seeing, not that, but an escalation of the violence and the genocide. And we're openly informed they are back to finish the job. They are back to ensure that no Palestinians will be left on Palestinian land. And the people that are there are surviving amongst dead bodies of their families and their people. No water, no energy, no hospitals, and being starved to death. And we talk. And what is Ireland doing? Along with our sweet words, we are actively colluding with genocide. We are actively colluding with the slaughter of innocent people. I know it's difficult for you to hear this, Taoiseach, and please don't waste your reply, if you could, in telling me how grateful the Palestinian people are to us. I know you're going to tell me that. I've been told it repeatedly. And of course they're grateful, and of course we should be proud and that we recognise Palestine. But that's the bare minimum we should be doing faced with a genocide. And what we could do is end the military use of Shannon. At the very least, use the legislative powers that are there to stop the transit of arms being reported on a regular basis by the ditch. And the last government, Eamon Ryan told us there was going to be an inspection regime. I understand that's gone by the way. The Occupied Territories Bill that the leader of the Labour Party has welcomed, I also welcome it, but I don't trust you. I absolutely do not trust you in relation to the Occupied Territories. You could stop the trade agreement that Europe has with Israel. You could end the central bank issuing war bonds. And you might explain the American Jewish Committee that the Taoiseach met in America in relation to the next steps of agreement. Please clarify that. Garamond.
Tánaiste.
I'm kind of so sick and tired of you misrepresenting my position and demeaning all that we do as sweet words. And I'd really love, I'm not sure I would actually, but I'd really love if sometime you were in Brussels with me at some of these meetings where we're working extraordinarily hard on these issues, and where if you ask any other member state, or indeed the Israeli government, do they feel that Ireland isn't taking action to support the people of Palestine? So I'm not going to say, you asked me not to talk about what we've done in terms of recognition, so I'm not. But I'm going to tell you 5 things we are doing. Firstly, we're actively involved in the ICJ case. We took a decision, that used to be your demand. We took that decision, and we took that decision as one of only a very small number of countries to actually intervene in a case in the International Court. And at a time when international courts are coming under attack from others, we're proudly standing with the international courts and speaking up for international law. That's something I'm proud of doing. That's an action. That's not sweet words. So I presume you recognise the importance of international courts. That's a practical measure. Second thing we're doing is providing very significant humanitarian aid. My colleague, Minister Neil Richmond, who has responsibility for this, we have today trucks in Jordan with enough aid for 6,000 people in Gaza. Practical measures taken by your constituents and mine to fund and pay for aid. We need to get that aid into Gaza, but it's a practical measure. It's not sweet words, don't be so flippant. The third thing we're doing is supporting UNRWA. Again, talk to the Director General of UNRWA. Ask him how supportive this government has been. Not only have we provided €38 million at a time when others have walked away, walked off the pitch from UNRWA, we've provided €38 million on behalf of the people of this country, and I've announced in my role as Tánaiste a further €20 million in support for UNRWA to keep UNRWA working in Gaza, in the Middle East, a very practical measure, not sweet words or the flippant point you make. The next thing we've done is worked with Arab countries. I've met the Minister in Jordan, the Minister in Egypt, the Palestinian Prime Minister, all in recent weeks in Munich and in Johannesburg. I've met these people, and we're supporting the Arab Plan for Reconstruction, saying to people, including the United States, we see your plan in relation to the displacement of people from Palestine as utterly unacceptable and in breach of international law. We want an alternative plan for Gaza that sees no role for Hamas, I'm sure you'd agree with that, no role for Hamas, a brutal illegal terrorist organisation, but does see the reconstruction of Gaza and a new governance and security arrangement in place. That's the fourth thing we're doing. And the fifth practical thing we're doing is we're engaging in relation to advancing the commitment in the programme for government in terms of legislating in relation to the occupied territories. 5 practical measures that doesn't include the recognition of the State of Palestine that we are taking to help people. Not sweet words, real action. But you know what? Diplomacy is tough. It takes real action. In fact, if anyone's talking sweet words, that's only you.
Deputy Connolly.
You know, I'd prefer to stay in silence at the failure of you to respond. And in recognition of the genocide that's taking place in our name, the word you're not using, genocide in our name. You have refused to condemn the genocide. You have refused to condemn Trump and the American government for fully backing genocide. We have called out Russia for its illegal invasion. We have supported you on that, and you utterly failed to call out what Israel is doing. They're ignoring all international law. They are committing genocide in our name, while you talk about silly words across in our name. Stop using... Thank you, Lescan Corley. Stop using Shannon to carry destructive weapons. Enact the Occupied Territories Bill immediately. Stop trade with Europe. End the dual export of products. You know, the interruptions by all of you is a measure of your absolute absence of realisation of what's happening on the ground, and that you need to join in with a Tánaiste that's utterly failing to answer the questions. And can you please go back to the committee that the Taoiseach met in America when he was over there?
Deputy Connolly, I'll ask you
Commitments
to conclude,
were given.
please.
It's reported in the paper that agreement
Deputy
was
Connolly,
made in relation.
please
I was
conclude.
interrupted.
And I've allowed you over time. Tánaiste to respond.
Well, the Taoiseach is entirely correct to meet representatives of the Jewish community, as do I. As do I. Anti-Semitism is disgusting. Anti-Semitism is despicable. There are hostages who've been taken from the people of Israel, from families, and they need to be freed. And the carry-on of Hamas is utterly despicable. Parading children's caskets like some sort of sick, twisted act of propaganda. Hamas need to be condemned, and we here in this government will always engage proudly with the Jewish community at home and abroad. But we'll also speak the truth. We stand up for international law. We utterly condemn the actions of the Netanyahu government. Utterly. We condemn it. And we want to talk about genocide. Read our submission in relation to the ICJ. It must be exhausting to think you and you alone carry responsibility and care for this. We care passionately, and we're actually acting. And I'm proud of the actions of the Irish government in relation to this. And so are many people right across the country, and so is the government of Palestine.
Thank you very much.